We're going to get started. We'll leave the door propped there for a few minutes for the folks who might be coming in a little bit late. But I am thrilled that we have an intimate group here tonight. Should be a wonderful talk and a good opportunity to have a Q&A session with Richard after the fact. Welcome. My name is Josh Owen. I'm the Vignelli Distinguished Professor of Design and Director of the Vignelli Center for Design Studies. Tonight marks the second event of the 23-24 academic year's Vignelli Design Conversation series, presented by Design Milk and RIT's Magic Center, and made possible in part by the generosity of RIT alumnus Chris Bailey and Bailey Brand Consulting. For tonight's lecture, we're also partnering with the Cary Graphic Arts Collection here at RIT, and thank them as well as Dr. Stephen Galbraith for their generous support tonight. I'd like to begin by offering my thanks to RIT's Magic Center and their team of faculty, staff, and students, as well as our interpreters for this evening, Lola Johnston and Nancy Kuykendall, for their work. Rochester Institute of Technology's Vignelli Center for Design Studies is an international hub for education, research, collaboration, and advocacy, which expands the scope of the programs in the College of Art and Design School of Design. The facility houses the archive of renowned designers Lella and Massimo Vignelli, whose works are icons of international design. The center and archive sit within RIT's College of Art and Design, which was built on the traditional territory of the Onondaga, or people of the Great Hill. In English, they're known as Seneca people, the keepers of the Western Door. They are one of the 6 sovereign nations that make up the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. We honor the land on which RIT was built and recognize the unique relationship that the indigenous stewards have with this land. That relationship is the core of their traditions, cultures, and histories. We recognize the history of genocide, colonization, and assimilation of indigenous people that took place on this land. Mindful of these histories, we work towards understanding, acknowledging, and reconciling. As stewards of history and content, we must acknowledge and seek to learn from our context, bad and good, ugly and beautiful. This applies to the Vignelli Center as with any archive. The Vignellis taught us that design is a systematic framework for solving the world's most intractable problems. If recent times have taught us anything, it's that while we as humans are adaptable, our societies and systems have significant flaws. We remain at a point where we need to have difficult discussions and work to create a new balance in the world. In this, design must continue to play a critical role. As director, I aim to make the Vignelli Center more accessible and applicable by bringing in stimulating guest contributors from diverse and underrepresented backgrounds who help us to consider design in innovative ways. The Vignelli's Design as One philosophy leaves us with the universal message that design can be a lens through which we can envision a more inclusive and more sustainable tomorrow. This evening, we are delighted to welcome back distinguished designer, educator, author, and artist, Richard Poulin. Richard comes our way via the mid-century modern enclave of Palm Springs, where he lives in Southern California. Throughout his career, he's focused on a generalist approach to all aspects of design, including graphic, experiential, interior, and exhibition design, dividing his time between professional practice and academia. For over 30 years, he was creative director and managing partner of Poulin Morris Inc, which he co-founded in New York City in 1989. As a highly respected educator, he taught at Cooper Union and the School of Visual Arts for over 2 decades. He is a recipient of a research grant in design history from the Graham Foundation for Advanced Studies in the Fine Arts, a recipient of a fellow from the Society of Experiential Graphic Design, the profession's highest honor, and his work is in the permanent design collections of the Denver Museum of Art, Letterform Archive, Library of Congress, and the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. Richard is also the author of several books on graphic design, typography, and design history, which have been translated into 8 languages and used by students and practitioners worldwide. His new book, a comprehensive monograph on the life and work of mid-century modernist designer Rudolf de Hark, Rational Simplicity, Rudolf de Hark, Graphic Designer, was released this past year by Thames and Hudson in London. As an artist, his multimedia collage constructions have been exhibited throughout the United States and are in the collections of several private collectors. On a personal note, I must add that Richard embodies many of the attributes that the Vignellis sought to disseminate with their own work. So it is especially meaningful to think of his presence tonight as an extension of why we are here. Please join me in a warm welcome from the Vignelli Center and RIT to the indelible Richard Poulin.
Good evening, everyone. Is that loud enough? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I wanted to start with giving you some basic information about what drives me as a designer. Over the years, I've constantly been asked what I enjoy about design, and I find it to be the most impossible question to answer because my interests are, 1, varied, and 2, always changing. So, I wanted to start tonight because, my life as a designer has always been organic, and I think it's very much fluid in terms of as the world changes, I've changed to accommodate that, but I've also tried to influence the world in my own narrow sphere to see if I could change the world and influence it. However, there's one aspect of being a designer which is constant for me. It is a common thread that I've relied upon my entire career or professional career. And I'll clarify, since I'm going to talk about this book, I'm not doing a promo on Dave Letterman or something like that. But the fact of the matter is I love books. And for me, if I had to answer that question that I started with, it would be currently that I love books. And one of the main reasons why I love writing books and designing them now, since I'm not running an office anymore, is that common thread for everything in my life, from the beginning, or at least from the beginning when I met Rudolf de Hark, was history. History, I feel, is really one of the essential elements of the design process. And without understanding historical context and meaning of that history, one isn't going to be as successful as they can. So I have 3 quotes to share with you tonight to start this off. History is about change, about consequences, about cause and effect. It is the mystery of human nature, the mystery of time. History is music, poetry, drama, science, love, and passion. History is also transformative. It is a window into the past as well as the future. Looking back for inspiration and insight allows us to look forward with awe and wonder. History is life. Now, to give you some background, I'm not going to leave it obscure so you don't know who said these wonderful statements. I was at a dialogue or a discussion at the 92nd Street Y several years ago. And the reason I went is that these 2 individuals were a few of my favorite visual storytellers of all time. Documentary filmmaker Ken Burns and author and historian David McCullough. Now you may ask, well, what is he talking about? David McCullough is an author, but if you've ever read any of David's work, which I've read everything more than once practically, he uses words, and I'm always drawn to authors like this, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, where all of a sudden I can close my eyes and I can visualize the beginning of the building of the Brooklyn Bridge, or the expatriates that moved to Paris right before the exposition that introduced the world to the Eiffel Tower. There's a real richness to his language. So in that way, I've always been drawn to the work of those 2. As creative forces, I also always thought that they were modernists. And the reason why I'm saying that they were modernists is that they didn't limit themselves, and they really pushed the creativity and the artistic expression of their own worlds to new heights and new forms of learning and communication. This was the thinking that also was embraced by the first wave of modernists in the United States, especially in the 1940s and the 1950s. And some of these names you may be familiar with, but they have a direct connection to the subject of my talk tonight, which is the life and work of Rudolf de Harrick. So I'm talking about modernists such as Alvin Lustig, Paul Rand, Saul Bass, and this gentleman, whoops, right here, Rudolf de Harrick. So to give you a sense, and I don't want to spend too much time, I know I only have 45 minutes, but I've written, and primarily, I'm not trying to pat myself on the back, but this is my 9th book, and it has been one of the best experiences in my professional life. Not only in terms of researching it, but designing it, and really doing what I was hopefully wanting to do from the initial proposal. It's over 500 pages, over 70,000 words, and 500 images. So it's like my little baby, so to speak. But to give you, so it's hard to condense a 50-year career in 45 minutes. So I'm just going to give you some brief points of Ruda's career, and then I'd really like to take you through a selection of his work over that 50-year period. So the first thing I'd like to share with you is that, he was self-taught, but in my opinion, he was one of the most influential graphic designers of the 20th century. Unfortunately, he's one of those unsung heroes, primarily because of his personality and the way he felt about being self-taught, as opposed to his peers, such as Alvin Lustig or Paul Rand, where they either went to Yale or they went to Brooklyn College with Sergei Chermayeff, or other prominent educational programs that really started the movement of graphic design education in the United States. But throughout his 50-year career, he always felt like he was an anomaly among his peers, yet no one equaled his diversity nor his accomplishments across the various design disciplines. Just in terms of recognitions, he was the first recipient of the United States Presidential Design Award, and he also received AIGA's highest honor, which was the gold medal. He was inducted into the Art Directors Hall of Fame, and one of the things he was most proudest of was that he held the Frank Stanton Professorship in Graphic Design, which some of you may not be aware of, but that was the first permanently endowed chair in the United States in graphic design. And if you're familiar with the name Frank Stanton was the co-founder of CBS, which back in the early days, and if you know graphic design history, CBS was one of the 3 networks which was really at the forefront of graphic design. He also received an honorary doctorate from the Corcoran School of Art, and these are the things that really didn't matter that much to him. And I go back to why he felt he was an anomaly and unsung, because it was always about thinking about new ideas, considering new ground, and this all came from his background and training. So a little on his background. He was born in Culver City in 1924. Culver City is in Southern California. It's about an hour and a half from where I live in Palm Springs. And he never really talked about his childhood. He was the youngest of 5 children. They moved around a lot. His parents divorced when he was 10. And he ended up, and I'm giving you the Cliff Note version of his early history. He ended up in Astoria, Queens, went to a technical high school, which was critical for someone of his background, and especially with regard to the work that I'm going to show you, because it gave him a variety of technical skills that really allowed him to transition from a technical artist in the late 1940s to the designer that he became over a 50-year period. He was involved he fought in World War II, which he rarely talked about, and ultimately when the war was over, he was wounded, came back to LA, and he started reconnecting with a friend of his from high school who was a graphic designer at one of the major studios, And coincidentally, this friend of his brought him to 2 lectures that happened within a month time span between one another. And one was with Gorgi Kepish, and the other was with Will Burton. And in that month, that was the beginning of the path and the journey for Rudolf de Harrick in terms of graphic design, visual communications, whatever nomenclature, whatever identifier you want to use. He just knew that there was something there. Keep in mind, up to this point, he's now 22, and he had no concept or no idea of what graphic design was. In LA, just to make a living the first 2 years after the war, he functioned basically as a mechanical artist and basically did paste-ups and layouts. Primarily because he had these technical schools from this high school in terms of drafting and precision and things of that nature. Okay, so now I get to the heart of the story. We're now at 1950, and he decides to leave LA and come back to New York, where he ended up most of his adult and teenage life. And he started to look for a job. And coincidentally, he got a job as a junior promotional art director at 17 magazine under the tutelage of, first name that, I'm going to mention a lot of names that are coincidentally in the Carey archive. C.P. Pinellas, or C.P. Pinellas Burton, because she ended up marrying Will Burton much later, but she was the art director, and this was his first professional job. He had no training, but for some reason he got this job. And he ended up at this location. So this is where modernism, really takes a stronghold in the United States, especially in New York City. This is the Look Building at 488 Madison Avenue, and it became really the creative hub of everything that was happening in graphic design, advertising, book publishing, and editorial design in the late 1940s and primarily through the 1950s and the 1960s. So just to give you a sense of things, this was the home of Esquire magazine, of 17 magazine, obviously of Look magazine. And Rudy would tell us stories at times where he would be in the elevator and he would meet initially people like, here goes the list, Alan Hurlbut, Paul Rand, Art Kane, Henry Wolfe, Sol LeWitt, Ben Shahn, C.P. Pinellas, obviously, Andy Warhol, Jay Maisel, and Richard Avedon. A lot of those people are also referenced in the archive, but a lot of those people he became very close with and good friends and worked with over the years. To give you some insight into Rudy's personality and work ethic and the fact that obviously as he became friends with people like Paul Rand and Henry Wolfe, he did feel inadequate because of his lack of training compared to all these great people and these successful people. So after 18 months at 17, he just quit his job. He couldn't deal with, and this was constant throughout his life, I dealt with it for 10 years as his partner, he couldn't deal with the bullshit of the corporate culture, whether it was in a magazine or whether it was for a corporate client. But this was the impetus for him to really go out on his own and to really force himself, because he was really very excited about learning about this profession, what he needed to know and how he could find his own voice within all these other people that were influencing him, such as the people that I just mentioned that he would connect with at 488 Madison. So I'm going to start to take you through some work, and the first series of work are a series of album covers. And these first 3 are very much the start of what he was trying to explore. And they're very derivative of, in this case, the first 3 are from Columbia Records. Alex Steinweiss, you may know that name, but really changed the face of music publication, specifically album cover design, starting in 1947 for Columbia, but working more than 20 years there, where prior to Alex, an album cover was basically book cloth and the identifying information on the spine of the album. He introduced everything we take for granted today in terms of figurative imagery, playful typography, and the like. He also was the first to introduce quote-unquote graphic designers to the music publishing world. So this was, if you know the work of Paul Rand, is very evocative of Paul Rand. And he was the first to admit this. And then obviously a great influence, because they were great friends, was the work of Alvin Lustig. Very different than Paul Rand, where here we're dealing with very specific figurative elements, figure ground, photography. Alvin was much more ethereal in terms of the images and the visual vocabulary that he was always using for his work. But these were experiments in Rudy's mind. He was still searching, he was still looking, and at the same time, he was determined to find his own, what he would call hidden order, to the language that he was trying to develop for himself. This was another one that I felt was very much Alvin Lustig, but these were all early, and these were all 1950 or 1951. In 1953, he was still struggling. This is him in his first office space. He was freelancing. He was really struggling to make it work. This is at the same time he started working or teaching a visual communication class at Cooper Union. Now keep in mind, as I mentioned, he didn't have any training, but the fact is he was trying to do this work for 3 years. Cooper Union hired him. He didn't understand why he was hired as a teacher, and he ended up basically directing that program for over 25 years. Okay, so the first opportunity that really came his way was through Henry Wolff, who was the art director and the creative director for Esquire magazine. And this is where, at the same time, in addition to trying to learn as much as he could about visual communications, not only the history of graphic design, but just what was being done by his colleagues and peers, he was also intrigued and just drawn to what was happening creatively in New York City at the time. So architecturally, we're dealing with the introduction of the international style. We're also dealing with, at the Museum of Modern Art and other cultural institutions, the introduction of abstract expressionism, op art, Dada. He was very influenced by that, and he was intrigued. He never, as I was mentioning earlier, was interested in only doing one thing. For every time he was trying to refine his skill in graphic design, he was interested in photography. He trained himself on photographic techniques, developing different processes and things of that nature, and at the same time he started to paint. The first work that he did with Esquire magazine and Henry Wolff was that he was asked to develop spot illustrations for fiction or nonfiction articles that would supplement or give a hint visually of what that narrative was all about. He called these illustrations or spot illustrations jazz-like Dada improvisations. So this, in my mind, was the first time he was really finding strength in his own unique approach. No one had ever done anything like this. You didn't really see collage-like or Dadaist-like elements in any editorial design. And granted, Henry Wolff gave him a lot of free rein, and he did, over a 2-year period, over 50 of these. Again, he was experimenting the first 5 to 10 years of his career, trying to see where he fit and what excited him. Now things started to take off. His freelance business was growing a little, and he was asked to design album covers for a variety of different music publishers, primarily in the jazz world. This is one of the first covers that was recognized by the Museum of Modern Art. This is, let me just give you a time frame here. This is 1952, and it was the first time that his work was acquired and put in the permanent design collection of MoMA. But this is where, again, he's considering his own language and developing it and refining it. Typographically, color palette, imagery. As I mentioned earlier, he also found his interest in photography growing. So at the same time, he became friends with Romaldo Gergola, who had an architectural background, but in the late 50s, early 50s to late 50s, he was the art director for Interiors magazine and hired him several times to do covers. This is one of his photographs, and just to make it work, he rotated it 90 degrees. of this bocce court on the Lower East Side. And then a series of covers. My intent in showing you this type of early work was just to show, again, the variety and the diversity of things he was trying to experiment with. He was very intrigued early on by his strengths and weaknesses of image making. This cover for Graphis, which is 1957, was the first time where he combined his interest in three-dimensional form as well as utilized photography, his own photography, in his own work. And this is a hint to come later in terms of the influence and the impact he had on a graphic designer transitioning, for lack of a better term, three-dimensional work. And while this is early 1960s, again, just to show you the variety of the vocabulary that he relied upon for image. Again, but it was always, and it's one of the reasons why I've titled the book Rational Simplicity, that he was looking for how much he can say with as little as possible. Okay, so really the first turning point in his career were really two commissions. One was to be the primary designer and art director for album covers for Westminster Records, which was primarily a jazz label, and the second was McGraw-Hill paperbacks, which I'll get to in a minute. But I wanted to share with you at least some of these album covers. He did 47 over a 3-year period. And again, I think the strength of this is that he was starting to further refine the language and the approach he wanted to take with work. For example, the majority of these compositions are all asymmetrical. They all rely upon one typeface, which he never had done before. He uses or introduces, and Phil Meggs actually confirmed this in his latest version, or before he passed, of the history of graphic design, where Rudy was one of the first 3 Americans in the early 50s to introduce the typeface Accidens Grotesque to the United States. Now you have to keep in mind, for the students in the audience, this is not anything of digital form. This is doing your research with a foundry. This was developed and produced by Berthold Foundry in Berlin. It was not in the United States at the moment. He wrote away, and they actually sent him type specimen sheets. If some of you, the students in the audience, were in the class earlier today with when we were doing the collages, there were specimen sheets. So he would take those specimen sheets and he would enlarge them or reduce them. So every piece of typography that you're going to see that's Accidens Grotesque on the album covers or on the book jackets, which I'll show you in a second, are all done by hand. So nothing's typeset yet because it's not available in the United States. So everything here is done by hand in terms of not only the leading but the kerning, and I'll point out some nuances. And it was wonderful to see, and I'm not saying this because Stephen Galbraith is here, but one of the great experience for me coming to RIT was the research that I did over a week's time at the archive, and to see some of the original art. This goes back to what I was saying about that training he had in that technical high school about precision and such. Some of the artwork, or all of the artwork I should say, that's in the archive that was saved for these album covers. I mean, it's an incredible experience, and it's so revealing the level of detail. You know, this, just keep in mind that all of these are cut with a blade, and it's all ruby lithe, if you know what that material is. So I'm going to mention a lot of early materials that probably most of you have never heard of, or I definitely don't use anymore, but the majority of these are done in film and by hand. The same thing with the typography. This is all hand spaced and pasted. Cut paper again. I call your attention to, you know, the finesse he had in terms of, look at the descender of the Y in fidelity and the connection, but again, it has its own space to the word ancient. They're not infringing upon one another. And then look at the slash, which was not part of the Accidens Grotesque cut, but this he did with, if anyone knows, or the students in the room, what a rapidograph is. I won't even talk about ruling pens at the moment. This is one of my favorites also because in the archive, there are a dozen different brushstrokes for this one album cover. And again, I've talked about the technical side of this, the skill level, but again, he was trying to find a new way to express a story, to express an emotion that allowed you to understand a genre of music. This was very unique and somewhat groundbreaking because most of these covers were done in 1960 or 1961. Even the implication of sound and space, if you pay attention to the word spacing of nothing but, and then the exaggerated spacing of percussion. I mean, granted, at this stage, he's experimenting, but at the same time, he's having a lot of faith in the viewer because I don't know how many people would pick up on that detail. But I have a lot of respect for, at this early stage in his career, that he was really thinking in unique ways and hoping someone would get it. More cut paper. I should also mention that he was also responsible for the identity for Westminster, as well as the logotype. Another one of my favorite covers, this is a series where there's, on the Bach-Brandenburg music, there's actually 4 covers. They're all different solid colors, a red, a blue, a silver, and a black. One of the great things about this is that, going back to, if you remember that graphics cover, he was always intrigued by the three-dimensional world and how to represent that in his early years graphically. This is another great piece of artwork that he produced, which he did use a ruling pen, but the actual art is produced 200% larger, and it's actually hand-drawn with a ruling pen and India ink on a frosted vinyl. And then one of his most recognized covers is the Vivaldi Gloria, which is Baroque. He's evoking stained glass here and just the beauty and the subtlety of color and form, but with pure geometry. And then another one of my favorites, Sound from the Alps. A very unique and novel way of approaching imagery. And it goes back to some of the points I made in class today. This says a lot about not only the designer who's considering a new visual vocabulary, but it also speaks to the client. That Westminster really went out on a limb, so to speak, because no one had ever done something like this before. Would it have an appeal to the public? Okay. The other groundbreaking project, and primarily this is one of the most prominent projects that he's known for, is his work for McGraw-Hill paperbacks. This also started at the same time period as the Westminster covers. I'll go through these a little bit more quickly. But he's refining his approach with a more structured grid, the use of asymmetrical compositions, and the use of the accidents grotesque. But primarily his experimentation was more about building imagery. He relied upon and expanded from his work with the album covers for Westminster, where sometimes they were abstract, sometimes purely graphic, sometimes photographic, sometimes illustrative. He was really trying to build on his skill and his understanding of how far he could go with certain imagery. Now, this is much easier to do today with a computer, but keep in mind that he generated this and photographed it on a piece of film and then manipulated it on 2 easels with light and then photographed it again. So, in terms of, I didn't know this at the time, but knowing this history of some of the things he did, and this is all by himself. He doesn't have a staff yet. It's just sole proprietor, and he's doing this because he's exploring. The aspect of duality and optical illusion. Again, his photograph double exposures, experimentation of color field, more humorous. It was a very broad approach, and the intent was never to have one style of imagery or one type of vocabulary. But the illustration, the photography, any of the hard edge work or the loose work was all done by him. This was groundbreaking and so influential, you may be familiar with a British designer. He's actually Czechoslovakian, but worked for Penguin Books in the mid-60s. And his name was Romic Marber, and he was hired by Germano Fassetti, who was the art director for Penguin for 30 years. And Romic had always stressed and communicated that Rudolph de Harrick's work for McGraw-Hill book covers was really his influence. If you look at what Romic did for Penguin, it's only the crime series. They're all this intense green color. He always uses black image on a solid field of the green, but also uses accidents grotesque. So he was influencing a new direction for the publishing world, which was never really done before. A reliance upon simplistic imagery, abstraction. A very diverse approach. Reliance upon his photography again. This was all done with Vaseline on the lens. No Photoshop. Going through this 4-year process with McGraw-Hill also refined his skill and his understanding of color, which he used a great deal on this work. Okay, I'm going to jump now. We're now 1965, and he was given an opportunity through AIGA, American Institute of Graphic Arts, and CITES, which is the Smithsonian Institution, a traveling exhibition service, to design a traveling exhibition that could be mounted, installed, and then demounted in a very simple way, as lightweighted as possible. There are two, I only have black and white photographs here, but this starts to show that a reliance upon, since they're black and white, I'll explain to you that it's all corrugated board, cut, and tabbed and slit so that you could fold these compositions to create this one monolithic element. And on the fascias of each element are solid black silkscreen identities. The traveling show was on the history of American graphic identity from 1950 to 1965. So this was his foray into exhibition design, which really became the major vehicle for his refinement as a storyteller. In the foreground on the right-hand side, you'll see the 4 circles, and then the figure ground reversal. That's his identity for Kurt Versen lighting, which is still around today. So over 60 years, that symbol is still being used. Okay, we get into the next phase of his career. This is 127 John Street in Lower Manhattan. I forgot to mention that Look building at 488 Madison was a precursor to the Seagram's building and Lever House, which are the two iconic modernist buildings in Midtown Manhattan. Both of those buildings were 5 to 7 years later. The Look building was 1950, and it was designed by Emery Roth and Sons, which really brought the international style to the United States, primarily Manhattan. 10 years later, they designed Emery Roth and Sons, this building, 127 John Street, and Rudy was hired to enhance it and create a fun, inviting, and warm and dynamic experience for what's called the pedestal or the base of the building. The owner of this building, the developer, thought it was too cold, and he wanted to sort of shake it up in terms of New York real estate. So this is the first time that Rudy did something larger than that exhibition at that AIGA gallery. But again, this man had no fear. If he didn't know something, he'd figure it out. If he didn't know how to document something, he'd figure it out. He was great at introducing himself to collaborators to realize his work. So what happens, if I just go back one slide, the entire 3-story space around the perimeter of the building is now enveloped with a grid structure of scaffolding and colorful painted canvas banners that identify tenants, that not only become identifiers for the building and major tenants, but also our sun and weather protection for pedestrians who can start to utilize the plaza, which before Rudy's work was integrated to this space. It was just a generic urban space. The main element of this project was a digital clock that he introduced, which was 3 stories high, which is shown here in this black and white photograph. Again, can anyone guess the typeface used for the numbers? Accidens grotesque. And it's basically a digital clock. It's the only element of what I'm showing you on this project that still remains today. Unfortunately, it's now a residential high-end condo building, and adjacent to the clock is a Starbucks storefront. So here's a color shot that you can start to see. As I mentioned, it's 3 stories high. There are 72 squares. 60 squares are for the hours, and then 12 squares are for minutes and seconds. Each of those 3 are designated with a different color. He was also responsible for all the furniture and fixtures around the site. One of the best things I think that he ever did, you can see the gentleman there with his pipe, sitting in what was called the 127 John Street love seats. They were basically a very simple approach to taking a flat piece of steel, laser cutting it, and then folding it as if it was similar to that corrugated craft board exhibit that I showed you for AIGA, to create these forms and these love seats. He was responsible also for the telephone booth, the sculptures and the murals around the plaza. But like the super graphic clock, his main contribution to the space was the entrance tunnel, which was basically a 250-foot corrugated aluminum and steel tunnel that was banded in blue argon gas neon. And that led you to, from the outside to the interior of the building, to either the low-rise elevators or the high-rise elevators. It was a wild project, and I want to show you another quote, because this building opened in 1968, and it was the first time that the architectural critic in the New York Times referenced a graphic designer for their work, which again was major, based upon his background. So at its completion, Ada Louise Huxtable, she was the first architectural critic for the New York Times, described Rudy's contributions to the project as a veritable visual playground that entertained and enlivened a faceless street, greatly enhanced the building's architecture, and ultimately redefined the modern urban landscape. So that was a major recognition for him. The next few slides, as I mentioned, I'm just giving you a broad selection of work, but just to share with you the varied interests that he had. He also designed and made in his own vein, but also in terms of utilizing a metal shop that he rented out, a series of modernist clocks that are now in the Museum of Modern Art Design collection. This was the largest one, but you can see, whether we talk about or whether I reference the book jackets or the approach and the experimentation he was taking with the album covers, he was always looking to simplify and to say as little as possible with the least amount of graphic devices or elements. And I think this clock really says it all. The other one, which you may be familiar with, is the Aurora clock, which was very prominent. This was a couple of years later in 1969. It's still being sold at the MoMA Design Store, and it's just a series of patented polarizing filters that are sandwiched together and rotate in one direction. So every hour or every minute, I should say, that you're getting over 365 color combinations. Okay, I'm going to finish, because there's just so much work, with 3 major exhibition projects. But I want to reference, just so if you're interested in his work, the book, as well as his entire career, follows many, many aspects of design. He did a lot of work in identity and branding, publication design, editorial design, but the majority of his work changed and evolved as he opened an office, as his business and his clientele expanded. So from 1978 to his retirement in 1985, the predominant direction that he was taking with his work in his office was really in the world of cultural institutions and corporate museums, where he was telling very specific stories. The first, which really laid the groundwork for this type of work, was really his commission for the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And I should mention, since we talked about this earlier in class, the aspect of collaboration. This is the first time, not with 127 John Street, but with the Met, where he started collaborating with major architects all around the world. But really the most prominent collaboration and the most lasting one, they ended up throughout Rudy's career doing over 100 buildings together, was his working relationship which was with Kevin Roche and John Dingelow, who were the master planners for the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And his first project for the Met was really the Egyptian wing, when they purchased or acquired, much better word for a cultural institution, the Temple of Denver, because we know the history of this temple. This was a temple that was relocated to the United States when the Met acquired it because they were building the Aswan Dam at the Nile, and the temple would have been submerged based upon the water movement of the Nile. So his responsibility was pretty comprehensive with working with the Egyptian wing and the Egyptian curators and their director of education over a 12-year period. The Egyptian wing is approximately 126,000 square feet. And I mention these, I quantify these things, because if you remember what I was saying about his background, I mean, now he's responsible for some of the largest work that he had ever done within a 20-year period of his career. And especially with the Met, it was a 12-year project. So, you know, let alone how crazy he was, he had a lot of patience. So these next few images show you the influence he had with the Metropolitan staff on object placement, the design of the casework, all the interpretive information. For instance, due to the light level, the low light level of these galleries, and there were 46 of them, all the information in terms of it organized in a chronological way was either within casework or opposite, where it was a series of information tables which you see in this image. That gave you the detailed information about what was opposite you. And it was organized in a way that you could get cursory information about a certain aspect of Egyptian history along the Nile, or if you were more of a scholar, you could sit at those tables and get detailed information about any aspect of the collection. He was also responsible for the information design for all the didactic labels within the Egyptian wing. Two things you should note here. This was the first time that he introduced a more traditional typeface, no accidents grotesque. It was all Caslon 540. And the museum staff felt it worked so well that they embraced it as the museum typeface for all the other galleries before they did the redo, which I think was done maybe 10 or 8 years ago. The other great thing that even I tend to forget, because I started working with Rudy when they were working on this, these drawings are all done by hand with a rapidograph. No computer yet, not until 1983. This shows you the intro gallery. So again, a lot of the interpretive material is re-illuminated. On the back wall is a 25-foot long display of a timeline that covers the 2,000-year history of the Nile Valley, and then it was interpreted into a 12.5-foot two-sided accordion book, which is still available at the bookstore at the Met. I mention those things because, you know, in this way, I think exhibition design, especially telling stories like this, influenced him to take a more timeless approach to certain work. You know, I wouldn't agree if you said, well, I think the Westminster covers are timeless. It's a different approach. Information design and wayfinding. And then obviously because of the influence and the impact and the positive responses to the Egyptian wing, the office at this point, which was close to 20 people, was responsible for practically every other wing, from the Andre Meyer wing of Impressionism to the 20th century wing, the bookstore, as well as the shopping bags, which in terms of the broad scope of Rudy's portfolio and work, this happens to be, in many people's opinion, the most prominent piece that he ever did. And I think it has a great history because in terms of everything he's done before, it's rare that you see the duality of these very bright, quote-unquote, modernist colors juxtaposed with a very traditional, classical, transitional typeface, which is Caslon 540. The Met senior management loved the typeface. They hated the colors. They wanted some marbleized paper or something that was evocative of the same time period. And fortunately for Rudy, Kevin Roche convinced the powers that be that this was the approach. And it became one of the most prominent advertisers for the museum because you ended up seeing it on every street in New York as well as in other major cities around the world. They printed over 2 million of these a year for over 15 years. And before I show you the last two projects, I just wanted to show you again how some of his refinements in terms of his print work evolved into just a more refined language of hidden order that he was always exploring, like this cover for Linea Graphica. So, how am I doing on time, Josh? I wanted to share with everyone one story or one anecdote about these two guys. One is Massimo Vignelli, and the other one to the left is Rudolph de Herrick. And I think from my discussion with Roger the other night, this is a photograph, which I didn't make the connection. It's used in the book, but it's not captioned that way. This was a photograph of the two of them at the RIT Design Conference here in 1982. Rudy and Massimo were great friends, primarily when they first met through AIGA, because they were both president over the years. But I wanted to share with you something about me, which I'm really not focusing on tonight. So I'll give you 1982. The office is now moved from a small space in Midtown Manhattan to this vast 10,000 square foot space in the West Village. Casement glass windows. At night you could see the Hudson River, and facing north you could see the Empire State Building. In 1982, I was at the office for 2 years, and at the end of that year, I was promoted to an associate, which was a real plus for me. I was on cloud 9. Because he had this new office, and he designed every piece of furniture, light fixture, art on the walls, etc., within the office space. He threw this great party, Christmas party, at the end of the year in 1982. And invited everybody in the world that I had read about and dreamed about meeting, and one of those people were Massimo Vignelli. But just to give you a sense of who else was at this party, Gene Federico and his wife, who's also represented in the Cary Archive, Milton Glaser, Armando Milani, if I keep on going down the list, obviously Henry Wolfe, Tomoko Miho, which is another name some of you may know. Tomoko and Rudy were very good friends. It was just, these are the people that I've read about for years. You know, for instance, just to give you another insight into why I love books, to put myself through school at Pratt, I worked 5 days a week in the Art and Architecture Library for 4 years. That was my life after classes. And it was a great building because if you know anything about that library, it was designed by Louis Comfort Timpany. The stacks alone were a beautiful piece of art. So that's where I learned about all these people, and now I get to meet them. And obviously, because we're all junior, senior staff, we're over here. And these wonderful designers are up in the front of the office, where, by the way, Tony Bennett is there performing for the office. And the reason for that is Tony Bennett, who I quote in the book several times, was a childhood friend of Rudy's, and they kept in touch, and they played and they jammed together because Rudy was a saxophone player, and obviously you know Tony Bennett, but he sang 4 songs a cappella at our Christmas party. But at some point through the party, I get a tap on the shoulder, and it's Rudy, and he introduces me to Massimo. And Rudy leaves, and I have to share with you that I had read about Massimo. I had never met him before. This is 1982. And he actually talked to me for like 15 minutes. He was so intrigued that I had become, and impressed with that I had become associate. He wanted to know my background. It was just this wonderful exchange. And I was like, I'm amazed that I held my shit together. I mean, it was really an incredible experience. And then after that point, he was a big advocate for what I was doing when I was up for the presidency of AIGA. He supported it. And one of the things I'll hold dear to my heart, when I started my first book called The Language of Graphic Design, he offered to read a draft manuscript, and he gave me comments. And I still have that handwritten manuscript with his comments on it. And then when I became partner and the firm name was changed to DeHarrick & Poulin, he sent me a handwritten note, which I still have today, on his beautiful stationery engraved with super warm red type at the top. It's like, some people lust for other things that I can't mention in the mixed group. I lust for engraved stationery. Anyway, that's my little anecdote for Massimo, but it was a very special time. Okay, now, his primary collaboration with Massimo, which I know is probably, hopefully, I'm sure it is, Josh, in the Vignelli archive, is the work that Rudy did with Massimo, John Lees, Seymour Quast, and Tom Geismar, who was the chairman of this committee that was established by AIGA and the Department of Transportation. So in terms of the development over a 3-year period, this is now 1974, it was developed in a way that they could find a way to promote, as well as, I should say before promote, develop and design a series of unified symbols that could be used in all public transportation facilities in the United States. So only because there were no direct flights from Southern California to Rochester, I can tell you, as of today, their symbols are still at O'Hare, they're still in Rochester, and they're in our little dinky airport in Palm Springs. But the prototype for these were developed for all the bicentennial events in 1976. And this was a major influence in terms of any iconography and symbol that you see today for any Olympics. So this was a major achievement for those 5 individuals. And then again, because I stressed earlier about his exploration when he first decided to become a graphic designer, that he was really intrigued and interested and very passionate about developing new ways of seeing and structuring imagery, I've put in a couple of the remaining pieces of later work from the 1970s and the early 80s, such as this cover for Perspectives. He was also responsible for the logotype for the masthead, as well as the symbol for Alan Guttmacher Institute, which was the parent organization for Planned Parenthood. Public Relations Journal, which he was the consulting art director for, but he was also responsible for the logotype for the masthead. And again, it goes back to that title that I've used in the book of Rational Simplicity, trying to say as much as you can with as little as possible. And then the last poster he did in the professional world, which was for the first competition from AIGA, which focused on functional graphics. And this was his last piece of professional work, and he started doing collages in the last several years that he was in the office. And this is when we became partners. I had this original collage in my office in California. The only thing that we changed, I guess I was the art director for this cover, because he was struggling in terms of what to do, and I said, you have this beautiful collage. But the only difference was that where the 9 is, there was a accidents grotesque S. And I said, all you have to do is make it 9 because that's the volume number, and he did. And it was a terrific cover. but it's one of the special things that I have from him, which was this collage, which was actually cropped here. It's actually a 9 by 9 square. Okay, I want to finish with, and I'll do this very quickly, 2 exhibitions. In the 1980s, when it was DeHarrick and Poulin, we were doing a lot of museum work, and my sense, and I always felt that the last 2 projects that Rudy was really involved in were 2 major exhibitions. The first was for General Foods Corporation, which became the General Foods Collection, and the last one, which I'll show you, which was for Cummins Engine in Columbus, Indiana. Both of these were, again, collaborations with the Roche Dinkeloo office in terms of new buildings being designed, and within an architectural program they had designated, well, here's 4,000 square feet, here's 7,000 square feet, we need an exhibition. So then they came to Rudy, and it was up to him to develop a concept. With General Foods, for example, before I show you the end result, they thought, oh, we have 4,000 square feet, we're going to put old Ronzoni boxes and cans from Maxwell House Coffee, and we'll put all the ads from Jell-O, and it will just be this overwhelming memorabilia experience. And this is what I'm about to share with you is why I love design in terms of the influence we can all have as designers on a public or an audience being asked or invited to see something different that they find so close to them, and they somewhat take it for granted. So he was able to influence the culture of General Foods by giving them an alternate to the memorabilia thing that we had to show a concept for. And this was, why not celebrate your story of food by object? So what we proposed was that there would be a commitment to purchase a collection based upon our research of food objects over the span of time that dealt with food preparation, food service, food storage, and food processing. So what you're about to see is that there's this wonderful collection of material that was developed by our team at the office, but obviously Rudy was the primary force of this in terms of telling a story primarily through object, with minimal interpretive information, with the exception of captions on glass. So this shows you a variety of different perspectives of the collection. So the wonderful storytelling aspect of taking a beautiful Etruscan bronze bowl and putting it next to the first bowl of a similar shape with a top that Tupperware had designed. So you can make the summation of either form or function or scale. Obviously the material is different. So this really influenced the way the employees and the staff at General Foods reconsidered what they were doing and what they were adding to American culture. Okay, last project, which is really, and I want to start explaining this by sharing with you one last quote from another person, and that's Steve Heller, because this is really his crown achievement in terms of the last thing that he did, which was completed in 1983. And after Steve saw this, and this is a corporate museum in Cummins, Fort Cummins Engine in Columbus, Indiana. And if you know anything of Columbus, Indiana, it's really this wonderful architectural modernism mecca in the United States, where every architect who Rudy and I ended up working with, from Kevin Roche, John Dinkeloo, Cesar Pelle, Edward Larrabee Barnes, Frank Gehry, Ian Pei, Harry Cobb, we had the wonderful opportunity of always collaborating with these people, but they have all these incredible buildings here. And even down to the interpretive graphics that Paul Rand designed in terms of the orientation of the map as well as the wayfinding brochure. If you ever get the chance, if you happen to go to Columbus and just spend a couple of days there, architecturally it's a phenomenal place to be. It really is. So Rudy was given the opportunity of designing a story for Cummins Engine, and Steve Heller In summarizing Rudy's masterful approach to the Cummins Engine Corporate Museum, author and design critic Stephen Heller wrote that presenting histories and stories became de Herrick's prime talent and greatest pleasure. He always referred to himself as a storyteller, so exhibition design was a logical direction and his most exceptional. Dedicated to the efficient communication of information, de Herrick uses detail the way a composer scores musical notes, creating melodies of sensation to underscore meaning. His exhibitions are indeed symphonies to both enlighten and entertain. So the images I have to share with you today, this gives you an overall view of the galleries. And again, this is a situation where they develop an architectural program. The graphic designer or the exhibition designer is usually always the last person. So the architects have developed this space, but no one's ever considered what to do with that space. So a lot of times Rudy was frustrated because we really couldn't influence or change the space. You had to work within the confines of that architectural limitation. But he was very successful at making this work in a variety of different ways. In the foreground, so I should mention that in this situation, like General Foods, the team, the design team, but with primarily Rudy's direction, also functioned as the curators and the writers for these two museum exhibitions. So the primary focus here is on raising the machine to a level of art so people could see it in a whole different light. Not only the visitors, because that's why I mentioned Columbus, Indiana as this mecca, because there's a lot of students and visitors to these buildings, but more so the staff and the employees and the engineers and the builders at Cummins Engine. All of a sudden, like we did with General Foods, we asked them to consider what they did in a whole new light. And it really allowed them to redefine the value that they were bringing to the company, as well as what the company was giving them. So in foreground, this is the first race car that ran at Indianapolis 500, powered by a diesel engine. But before you entered the museum, you were forced to walk through a series of cranks and camshafts like a forest. But to allow someone to understand them in a new way, they were highly polished and put on a vertical axis as opposed to the traditional one of being horizontal in that truck or engine configuration. Getting back to the race car, you can see that in this situation we were able to influence the architectural finishes in the space, where if any of you know the earlier surfacing of the Indy 500 track, it was actually brick. That's why they called it the brickyard. So the introduction of the same scale and the same pattern brick with the same dimension of coursing between the bricks, and then separated by the stainless steel inlay so that you actually could see the difference between the wood parquet and the brick. The subtle details. You know, that's a subtle detail, like if you remember what I mentioned about nothing but percussion, the subtle detail of that word space. It's one of the things that I started to really understand about Rudy and valued a great deal. There are a series of early engines that were restored and reproduced, restored and installed in the new exhibition. The one on the right in red is the first diesel engine designed by Herman Diesel in 1912. As I mentioned earlier about the architectural limitations, here's a space where we could not influence what the architect had specified as the cladding on the walls. The entire space is bronze reflective mirror, which is very challenging for an exhibition designer. So it led us to create a series of displays that allowed the appearance or afforded the appearance of things floating. So the majority of the smaller engines are mounted on stainless steel cylinders that are highly polished. And then this museum also became a marketing center for them. That was our suggestion to Cummins, so that they had an opportunity to display the largest mainframe engines, diesel engines that came off the line. And then again, because of the limitations of the wall surfaces being mirrored, Rudy found a new way of explaining the materials of these new engines. So you can see in the background on the left there's this, what we called a materials totem pole. So it became a three-dimensional graphic chart, which basically showed the proportional relationships of each of the materials found in those engines. But the heart of this, and it goes back to raising the engineering element of the engine to an art form, was what Rudy called the exploded engine. This is a sketch from a cocktail napkin, he did like his red wine, to the heart and the center of this museum being their largest diesel engine, made up of 440 parts, suspended within a 2-story space with stainless steel cable, to basically create, if you know about axonometric drawings, or if you've ever built a model as a kid and you saw the exploded diagram of how to put everything together, this was so that from a marketing point of view, the staff didn't have to use their brochures anymore to market the various nuances, finishes, tolerances of the engine. They could bring their potential buyers, such as John Deere, down to the museum, and they could share with them or celebrate, I should say, as well as share the details of each of these parts and how they worked. And again, because of the limitations due to the mirror, the majority of the stories, whether it was the significance of the race car at Indy, or the difference between a diesel engine or the engine you may find in your car, all of that is done by film. And I wish I had the time to show you these videos, primarily because it goes back to what I initially shared with you about Rudy, where his interests were boundless, like Massimo. The thing that they both shared was that if you could design one thing, you can design anything. And that as long as you approach it with the same sensibilities and practical and system approach, you can do anything. And that's why it's unfortunate I can't show you the videos today, but they were absolutely beautiful. And because of his connection to music, which he loved, the music on both of them is just terrific. So, I'd like to just share with you two other things about Rudy, where, as I mentioned, but I've taken this from the book, so I'll share it with you. Rudy believed that good design meant cutting away all the unnecessary appendages, leaving only those elements that communicated and celebrated facts, thoughts, and ideas. He always looked to reduce visual elements to their most fundamental. Being simpler didn't necessarily mean the end result would be less profound. In many ways, it was the ultimate goal in his approach to rational simplicity. So, while that museum for Cummins Engine was the end of his professional career, he retired in 1985, moved to Maine with his wife Carol, and for the next 18 years before his passing, he designed their home, which was a post and beam home, actually built it with his stepsons. The home had a full darkroom, wood shop, and painting studio. And this is where he continued with his collages, his paintings, which gained major recognition, and his work was exhibited throughout the Northeast. Two of his paintings are in a permanent collection at the Whitney. He also taught himself, this is how crazy a person he was, and I mean crazy in the best way possible, because he was boundless in terms of his interests. He taught himself piano and he taught himself clarinet. Now when I say taught, because Tony Bennett was still alive, Tony and his wife at the time would go up there, and Tony Bennett was very particular about music, and if you were going to perform or play an instrument, you better have your shit together. So I know from a fact, in terms of how Tony shared his thoughts about this in the book that I used, that Rudy became as proficient with those new instruments as he was with the saxophone, which he played for 40 years. I mean, the man loved surf fishing. He designed his own rods in his wood shop, and he actually designed and made all the castings and lures for that. So the man loved life, and he loved every aspect of it. And he was a tremendous influence for me and my life. And I would just like to conclude with a really great quote that I actually found in an oral history that he did 2 years before he passed away with the Smithsonian Institution. And it's this. The explosion of a de Kooning brushstroke, the dynamic tranquility in a Mies curtain wall, the wail of a baby, or a high whine of a full-race Ferrari is visual storytelling. It's that dynamic symbology of Churchill's handheld aloft, with his fingers forming the famous V for victory. Also, two hearts entwined, carved indelibly into the tree of a trunk, speaking out. This is what I think, this is how I feel. Visual storytelling is commitment, and commitment is the essential element of modernism. It is making connections. That is what I learned the most about Rudolph de Herink, and it really changed the way I feel about everything in my life today. So with that said, I thank you for your time, and I know that went very fast, I hope you have a better sense of this man and the work that he did and his contributions to modernism, because I think they're very special. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think we have time for some questions.
okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
I could have gone on for another half hour.
Roger.
Richard, you've done a wonderful job telling us about Rudolph de Herink, his work. I'm just curious if you could expand a little bit more upon what it was like to work with him. What kind of a person was he in the office, and
Sure.
what was kind of the emotional situation when you were working on one of these fantastic projects?
That's a great question, and I've shared this with people before, so I don't mind sharing it with all of you. This man was intense. I don't know how I was ever able to have him hire me, because I'm sure in looking back, you know, I was a nervous mess on this interview because he was extremely forceful, very short-tempered. You know, it was a type of situation where I would turn a page in my portfolio, this is what I remember, and he said, "I'll do that." You know, it's like, okay, let me know when I can speak. He was that type of person. But, you know, people have always asked me, especially the people that I worked with in the office when I became an associate and then his partner, and, you know, they were shocked. How did you pull that off? Because, you know, most people thought he was a real pain in the ass. And I've always shared this story. You know the Jack Nicholson character in A Few Good Men? The Marine? That was my father. He wasn't a Marine, he was just a son of a bitch. But I had to learn to deal with that. So dealing with Rudy was a piece of cake for me. And I think that had, I don't know what the percentage is, but that had a good deal. It helped me understand who he was, and I could deal with him. Because, you know, over the 10 years, especially the last 5 years, we traveled the world together. It was always about work. We rarely talked about anything personal. He just wasn't that type. The things that I shared with you and the things that excited me about writing in the book, like I didn't spend any time with you today on his experiences with World War II and his experiences growing up and how he felt about his parents. All of this I found out either through all the correspondence at the Cary Archive or through the other people I interviewed, you know, 20 years after I stopped working with him, or 30 years almost. So he just wasn't that, you know, he didn't really have an interest in my personal life. And while I thought I had an interest in his, it was all about work. And I could understand that. You know, I always felt, and it just, I felt, I confirmed it with the research, that he always felt that he was here, and everybody else like Massimo and Arnold Sachs, and they were there, and he was always trying to catch up. He would never admit that to me because he was too proud an individual. But, you know, I think in many ways, it's one of the reasons why he never felt as successful as, you know, someone like Massimo. You know, part of the reason why he did that office, 10,000 square feet for 22 people, 24 people, you know, if any of you have seen at the archive, Massimo and Leila's office on 10th Avenue, I mean, that was an incredible space. He was nice enough to allow me to have events there for AIGA. But, you know, I think there was this competition to a certain extent. But, you know, you can't compare the business acumen that Massimo and Leila had with what Rudy had. So, you know, I think it was a struggle for him. And, you know, if you think about it, he retired from the office when he was 61. He died when he was 79. 61, he stopped working in the office. I don't know many people that did that. I think he was, in many ways, frustrated and fed up with, it's the same reason why I mentioned he quit 17 magazine after 18 months. He wasn't very good dealing with clients. He had great clients, but he never worked. And I don't mean this in a critical way. I love the man, but this was just his personality. He had opportunities. The only opportunity he really nurtured was the Metropolitan Museum. He never did any other work for Cummins, never did any other work for General Foods, never did any other work. We did this major museum for Conoco. It just wasn't in him. He was on to the next thing, and that was it. So I hope that answers your
That's
question.
great, thank you.
He was a great guy, but you really had to understand how to deal with someone like that. Intense. And the last thing I'll tell you is that, for me, I sacrificed a lot personally when I worked with him. We had very similar experiences, but generationally they were very different. I always felt that I didn't have the right training or education until I worked for Rudy. So, one of the reasons why I know I was made an associate, because I worked my ass off. I worked 6 days a week with him. I was the only person there on Saturdays. And when I didn't show up, he said, "What's the matter, you don't like work anymore?" He expected me there. But, for a good 10 years, when I say sacrifice, my focus was to get as much knowledge and much experience from this incredible man as possible. So my marriage, my relationships, my family, friends, that was all secondary. I don't regret it, but it was a big sacrifice now that I'm older and quote-unquote wiser. Anyway, I'm sorry, you had a question.
You mentioned how he moved to this city and basically somehow suddenly made all these connections and got these great jobs. And I think you hear that a lot about designers in the past. So how do you think that aspect of career and connection is different now with online and everything, and how is it
Sure.
the same?
I'm so glad you brought that up, because I've been thinking about this a great deal. In 45 minutes, what can I share with you and what I can't? I'm glad you picked up on that, because, the environment in the 50s in New York City was a very unique thing, where you had all these wonderful designers of certain levels of success, but they were good friends, and where they would hang out together, and, they would share ideas. Half of the reason why, or more than half of the reason why, that Rudy did or started his three-dimensional work was that he would run over to Will Burton's office because he felt Will Burton was like a father figure to him. And Will Burton shared staff people with him and ideas, and would look at work that he was doing, just to get a confirmation that the fact that he was now in this three-dimensional world doing exhibitions, that he was doing the right thing. And because of Will's work in that world, I think they developed a great relationship. But he had a lot of great relationships with these wonderful designers. And I can tell you, when I was running my office, while I had similar friendships, it was a different thing, because I think the world, I remember literally in 1983 when we got our first Macintosh in the office. And at that time, we had 24 people. When Rudy left in 1985, it was 24 people, and it was just me running the office. I'm amazed I'm still alive. But my point about the computer is that at that point, it changed everything from a business point of view, in terms of the business model for, quote-unquote, running and organizing and maintaining and sustaining a design consultant firm. So therefore, with the introduction of the computer, you think things did become more efficient, but at the same time it became more demanding because people expected more. It's not like, oh, I have this computer now, it's only going to take me half the time, I don't have to use the waxer anymore, or anything like that. I can just sit around and read a book. No fucking way. It just, exponentially, it just got more and more demanding. So therefore, I think business relationships and friendships, similar to the ones I mentioned in the 1950s, suffered for that. We all had to make value judgments. You know, do I want my business to succeed, or am I going to put something else first as a priority? It was a constant challenge for me. And in many ways, I can be, you know, it's one of the reasons why I closed a Herrick and Poulin, for 3 main reasons. I closed a Herrick and Poulin in 1989. I ran it for 4 years after Rudy retired. People expected me to be a Rudy clone, and it took me a long time to realize that. I wasn't fair to myself, because one person, unless you're just crazy, it's really hard to run an office of 24 people, and you're the sole proprietor and manager and director for that. I mean, I was either on a plane or in the office all the time. I didn't sacrifice relationships then, I just didn't have any. It was just me. And then just, you know, I wasn't treating myself very well, and I knew I wasn't a designer anymore. I was just running a business, making the wheels turn, making sure people paid, making sure invoices went out. And I'm not saying I didn't enjoy this, because I can't be a designer without those business characteristics, but it was imbalanced. So I took a year off after I closed it, and I started all over. And fortunately for me, I met my husband, and we started from scratch with 3 people, and we ended up with another 24 people, but a completely different structure. Completely different structure and a completely different value system. And there was no more, I want you to be Rudy's clone. That's why I appreciate the introduction when you said generalist, because I don't consider myself a modernist. Do I have time for one more anecdote?
Sure.
Okay, modernism versus generalism. I'll tell you, at the end of my working relationship with Rudy, not many people know this, but I can share it now since time has gone on. We were hired to be the interpretive planners for the United States Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. And one of the best experiences I ever had, which changed my life, was traveling to Eastern Europe, Russia, Israel, Germany, Poland, all in the same trip. I was away for 2 months with Rudy. Now, just to give you a sense of Rudy, extremely paranoid. For example, at that time, he didn't have any hair, so his wife gave him a baseball cap, New York Yankees. Comes to the office, he would never let Carol know this. He asked me to get a blue magic marker and block out all the white type for the New York Yankees, because as we were traveling through Western and Eastern Europe, he didn't want anyone to identify him as an American because he thought he'd be shot at. Paranoid. But I mention this because it was a great experience, and we were able to develop concepts. And there was this one visitation we had to this city in eastern Poland on the Russian border, and I have these photographs of all these women coming out of their homes and holding pictures of their lost ones in beautiful frames. And I remember specifically, we were in Warsaw at a restaurant. We went up to the room because he didn't like being alone. He wouldn't go down to the restaurant without me. He couldn't go up to the room without me. It was like, okay, whatever. But the fact of the matter is, I had sketched out, have any of you been to the Holocaust Museum? Okay, so if you know the Tower of Faces, that evening I had sketched out that this should be this experience that you wind up this tower, and there are 1 million, whatever the final number was, images of different people who were lost from the Holocaust, and each frame was different. Okay, we move on to other stuff, we come back to the city, and this is where I finally realized that I have to be very careful about modernism. Rudy took that concept, and the Tower of Faces became walls of black and white images, not of, like that woman who came out from her home, of that image that maybe she took from her bedstand or something. These were all images that were, unfortunately, I even am embarrassed to say it, but it was the images that the Nazis took of predominantly the Jewish people who were within the Holocaust, like a criminal photograph. So they had their number underneath, they had the striped garment on. And because I'm a modernist, I need to unify something. It needs to be all of the same so that it would have this visual semblance. My client hated it. hated it. And I didn't have the heart to tell Rudy. It's one of the reasons why we didn't end up being hired to design it. Ralph Applebaum, if you know that name, great museum designer. He was my teacher at Pratt Institute. But he ended up doing my concept for the Tower of Faces. That experience made me realize that I'd much prefer to be a generalist. So if I'm designing a book for A Christmas Carol, which is actually on the website, and we did it to Herrick and Poulin, that maybe I won't use accidents grotesque, I'm exaggerating. That maybe I'll use Caslon because it's transitional and it's of the same time as Dickens. Maybe the proportion of that book would be more of the golden mean because that was used in the 1700s, if I have my time frame correctly, et cetera, et cetera. That all came from that. That's what I feel a generalist approach would be. That while I may believe in modernism, it's not going to direct me. I'm going to direct it so I can understand where I can use it, where it's appropriate, and where not. That was one of the triggers that made me realize I have to change my career, and that while Rudy was a tremendous influence for me, it's very much like why he left LA and came to New York. He didn't want to be another he didn't want to be another, excuse me, I said Paul Rand, Saul Bass, or Alvin Lustig. He needed to find his own. And years later, it didn't connect with me until years later, that I was basically doing the same thing. So, that's another anecdote about Rudy. Any other questions? Well, thank you for your time. Really appreciate it. I hope
And I'll just say one last thing. This wonderful book is available through Shop One, if you would like to pick it up on the RIT campus. Otherwise, probably online, it's not too hard to find either.
And Josh isn't getting a percentage, so if he wants to say that, and I haven't offered him any bribe.
Have a great night, everyone. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.